Okay, you are 1/3 of the way through the module. In the first 3 lectures, we looked at Dada, Surrealism and Futurism, all movements born during or around World War I. And they were aligned to totalitarian ideologies. Italian futurism was fascist, Russian futurism and surrealism were aligned with communism. After World War II, there is less appetite for totalitarian regimes and revolutionary politics. Obviously, the horrors of Nazism make people a little bit less enthusiastic about that. So therefore, the notion of activating the masses in art and in life, I suppose, became undesirable and problematic. Instead, as we're going to see in the next third of this module, there was a move towards notions of freedom and away from authoritarian manifestos. If you don't remember, we started really with the 1909 with the publication of the Futurist Manifesto, but also there were Surrealist and Dada manifestos. So this is the theme, if you like, or the theme that runs through at least the next 3 lectures. See if you can notice it through this one. We have a critical context as well, and that is, well, theoretical context. We have the reading for today was Allan Kaprow's Elimination of the Audience, published in 1966. And a year later, a French author called Roland Barthes published a text called The Death of the Author, which was highly influential. In French, it's called La Mort de l'auteur, which sounds like the death of Arthur as well. So there's a pun in it. Now, you've read the Kaprow text, so you know that he is looking at eliminating the role of the audience, activating them still into becoming one with the artwork, to becoming participants in the artwork. Art not as something that you look at passively, but something that you actively participate in. And Roland Barthes' text, I think, in some ways can be considered to be similar. So primarily what he is saying is, once you publish a text, the author's intentions are no longer relevant. It's up to the reader who will interpret that text in any way that he or she deems necessary. So a key part actually of Barthes is that you don't need to know any. I think someone's got their mic on. Can you turn it off? You don't need to see any. I've lost my place. You don't need to know any biographical information about the author, where he or she was born or anything like that, the times they lived in or anything. Everything should be, according to Barthes, evidenced in the text, or not. You don't need to know what the author's intentions are. That doesn't matter, according to Barthes. It's all in the text and it's open to interpretation by the reader. The death of the author, he says, is necessary for the birth of the critic or reader. And we can substitute reader and text for artwork and art audience. It's applicable quite easily to art. So there was this idea in the late 60s that we should all be more involved in art, including literature, and we should take some kind of play some kind of role and challenge the authority of the author or the artist. That's basically a summary of what I've already just said. So, yeah, both can be seen as a challenge to authority, because everyone can and should get involved, have an opinion, don't play by the rules of the artist or the author, make up your own, use the text in the way that you want to, and both cede some authorial space, the space of the author, to the critic or to the participant. The social context of these next 3 lectures is, I think, some quite revolutionary times. So from just before the 60s start, you've got the Cuban Revolution. Communism is spreading to different parts of the world, South America, Asia, so Africa. The Algerian War of Independence ended and Algeria separated from France. And you might see that also as part of a broader anti-authoritarian move, because it's part of decolonization. The Algerians are saying we don't need to respect the authority of our colonial masters, France, we can govern ourselves. Following that, there was mass Algerian migration to southern France. So we're just beginning to see huge movements of people as well. We have the civil rights movement in America, Martin Luther King and all of that. And we have the counterculture movement from the 60s to the mid-1970s. This is, you might know a little bit about the counterculture movement, if nothing else, from bands like the Beatles and others. Somebody else is taking control of my presentation. Can you not do that, please? I'm going to take it back. Okay. Yeah, you might know it if through nothing else from the Beatles and from hippies. You might associate it with that, the Summer of Love and so on. A sexual revolution, by which I mean everything from the invention and distribution of the contraceptive pill, women taking control over their bodies, and it's generally anti-establishment. And we have the CND movement, last there on my list, which stands for complete nuclear disarmament. So it's anti-war, love and peace, anti-establishment, so on. It kind of comes to a head in May 1968, starting in Paris, but then spreading through the world. There are violent revolutionary protests, occupations, a bit like, in some ways, you could think of it a little bit like Occupy Wall Street, if you remember that. And it looks, for a time, like some countries, if we look, we started with Cuba, which did become communist and still is. But France looked like it might even become a communist country. There was a national strike. The students and the Renault car factory workers sort of formed together, and it really looked like there could be a revolutionary moment, but not for long, and it petered out. So the theme of this week's lecture is the death of the author and the death of the audience. That's the title, and I've introduced that with Roland Barthes and Allan Kaprow. Allan Kaprow is famous for inventing something called happenings. And if you are like me, before you knew about Allan Kaprow and happenings as an art term, you did know, or I did know, that the word happening was used in the 1960s quite a lot. So in the same way that maybe in Austin Powers you hear people say groovy all the time, people also said, as you can see on the poster on the right, what's happening, baby? It's all about what's happening. Happenings were, I thought, ignorantly before I knew, kinds of parties, because there were these art parties in the 1960s, maybe in big factories and warehouses, where artists have taken over and have these parties, which included perhaps bands like the Rolling Stones might turn up and play. There'd be famous fashion icons and models walking around. There would be artists painting things or projecting or doing performances, and everyone's kind of involved in this moment, this happening. So I'm just going to play a short clip from Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me from 1999, which gives a kind of idea of the flavour of what I was thinking about with happenings before I knew about Allan Kaprow.
Yeah, baby, yeah! That's fabulous.
You might need to push play actually if you want to see it. Okay, I've stopped it after 41 seconds, so if you're still watching, maybe stop about there. The thing, in fact, the screen at the moment, as I see it, it's paused with an Andy Warhol style print, screen print of Austin Powers on the back screen. There are lights, there are bright colours. Before this, we've seen things hanging, streaming. A car is in this kind of space where everyone's dancing and dressed in kind of 60s clothes. And that, to me, does actually have some kind of spirit of a happening. Okay, this is like a prologue to the lecture and indeed the whole lecture series. So before we start, I just wanted to point out that you could write an essay about this. Essay question number 4 is, were happenings necessarily participatory? Discuss what it means to participate in art. And like I say, with all the lectures, you've already made a start on that. You've done the reading, and now we're going to go through about happenings, and you could answer that question if you wanted to. Allan Kaprow, as we've established, invented happenings, and it was he who even coined the term happening. He was excited by the performative possibilities of painting, actually, and was mainly influenced by Jackson Pollock's action paintings and John Cage's sound classes that he attended. You might have already covered John Cage in Frameworks. If you haven't, you will do. Kaprow described himself as an unartist, someone who refused to participate in the traditional forms of the art world. Instead, he championed a practice that blurred the boundaries between art and life, moving outside of the gallery and the museum and insisting on active participation rather than passive spectatorship. By creating a happening or an environment, he starts by creating environments and then things happen inside these environments. Kaprow aims to create a heightened experience of the everyday for participants. Viewers would, he hoped, become fused into the performance and lose their identity as an audience. In fact, Kaprow wanted to abolish the audience or spectator completely, preferring the notion of the participant. This was integral to his work. As with Futurism and Dada, happenings were sometimes coercive. For example, in some of Allan Kaprow's happenings, the script that defined the action controlled everybody. Everybody participated together, and there was no space for critical reflection. The word happening and what the phrase "what's happening, baby" became so popular that eventually, when the Motown band, the Supremes, Diana Ross and all that, used it in a song title, Allan Kaprow decided to drop it. And I think that shows that it was he was linked into a broader cultural movement and feeling. People were using this term. It did kind of capture what was going on in the late 60s. Kaprow worked on this idea as he worked his art away from painting. He starts with this kind of fascination with Pollock, action, performative painting, and so on. We're going to see more of that actually in the next lecture. By 1957, Kaprow was making what he called arrangements out of unusual materials. These arrangements became environments for the viewer to experience, not just look at. In other words, he's basically invented installation arts. In 1957 and 58, he began to develop a series of actions that he called happenings, usually in his environments. The big one was called 18 Happenings in 6 parts in 1959. It was a kind of theatre piece, but it wasn't. The actors were everyday folk that Kaprow knew, and they did not act, really. They only performed everyday kinds of actions according to a carefully worked out score. Remember, he's influenced by John Cage's compositions. He's a musician, so he's calling this a scoring, like a musical score. He's scoring performances. You can think of it perhaps as more like a dance piece than a stage play. The set for the 18 Happenings included clear plastic sheeting with painting on it. Paintings that you could see through, that are obviously influenced by Jackson Pollock. The performers lined up very formally, like statues, more like dancers, and carried out their actions simply and very matter of fact. Invitations to the event said, quote, "You will become part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them. Once people arrived at the second floor loft space at the Rubin Gallery, they were given a program of events and instructions on how they should behave, including when to take their seats or move between 3 different spaces that he divided the place up into 3 different areas, or even when to applaud. And that was only at the very end. It lasted for about 90 minutes, hour and a half. The 18 simultaneous performances included painters painting on canvases, a procession of performers reading from placards, the playing of musical instruments, and it ended with 2 performers saying single syllable words like but, well, or so on, as 4 huge scrolls fell from a horizontal bar behind them. The end of the event was signalled by a bell ringing twice. In other words, Kaprow gathered together, Allan Kaprow gathered together huge piles of old tyres for yards, and he made a labyrinth of hand-painted paper signs through which people could wander, which you can see on the left there, words. Here, for Household, 1964, we have women licking jam off a car. Audience members were invited to make jelly sandwiches with automobiles as bread. What was this about? Was he perhaps talking about the fetishization of commodities, how we love cars in an almost visceral way, like we want to consume them like food? In another work, participants built a roofless bunker out of blocks of ice. We can see, if you know your art history, your recent art history, which you might not do, which we're going to cover in the rest of this module. But you can see that Allan Kaprow, or you will be able to see that Allan Kaprow is really beginning here to invent participatory art, installation art happenings. He's hugely ahead of his time. Throughout the 1960s, we find different modes of participation taking place in art, all done in the name of various types of emancipation. That means freedom, setting people free. With happenings in France, produced and theorized by Jean-Jacques Lebel, it is a sexual emancipation of the body. With Kaprow in America, participation is figured more as a kind of existential awakening that would enable participants to have a more perceptive, responsive approach to the world. That's according to Claire Bishop, actually in the text that you read for last week, but 2, so the futurist one, Bring the Noise, talking about the influence of futurism, but here looking at the 60s. So let's go to France. Let's look at Jean-Jacques Lebel. He made the first single-authored European happening at the Venice Biennale in 1960. It was part of a travelling exhibition come protest against the Algerian War. Do you remember I mentioned the Algerian War of Independence finished in 62? Lebel's happening ended with the internment of Tongly's corpse, or the burial of the thing of Tongly, who is an artist. It was a complicated, quasi-ritualistic performance that made references to the Marquis de Sade, who you will remember from the Surrealist lecture, and others, including Lebel's murdered friend, Nina Tor. So another artwork to exercise the spirit of catastrophe, which we have on here as the video. I'm going to push play on that now. Just going to turn the sound off. Maybe you should play that and turn the sound off. Here, it's an original happening, but it's been remade as a film, and it features, as you'll see in a minute, 2 nude women in a bathtub full of blood, wearing masks, one of Nikita Khrushchev and the other one of JFK, President Kennedy. This is the leader of Russia and America at the time, in the middle of the Cold War. There were jazz bands, there were erotic projections onto the naked stomachs of girls wearing masks, and Lebel wore a cardboard TV on his head while speaking about permanent revolution. Let's just watch this for a little bit.
questa fornita succursale dei cenacoli letterari francesi si agitano i primi fermenti artistici della cultura di domani, gli scrittori, i poeti e i pittori della nuova ondata. Manifestazioni come l'Happening sono da qualche tempo il prezzo che la cultura europea paga in silenzio per assicurare al proprio provato organismo.
Okay, I've stopped after 3 minutes. Can you do the same if you're controlling your screens? Yeah, we saw all sorts of things in there, didn't we? Spin paintings, 30 odd years ahead of Damien Hirst. I could have added gay liberation, gay rights to the social context at the beginning. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain and America until the 60s. So there's all sorts of boundaries being pushed here. This is not the kind of thing that your parents would necessarily approve of you doing. Lebel thought that the artist's role was one of a moral transgressor, giving image and voice to the repressed, hence why he refers to the Marquis de Sade, which you'll remember from the Surrealism lecture. And the whole thing actually is very much linked, isn't it, to the debates that we were having, perhaps, or at least my group were having in the seminar last week, about freedom of speech and the artist's right to push boundaries. Lebel was actually a member of the Surrealists, but he was expelled by André Breton in 1960. Lebel organised a happening called 120 Minutes dedicated to the Divine Marquis at the Theatre de la Chimère, where André Breton used to live. 400 people entered through Breton's back passage and were greeted by nude women acting as custom officials. They took fingerprints before allowing people to pass through a narrow corridor hung with raw meat. Coming onto the stage to find that all the seats had already been removed, the participants didn't know what to do. Acts featured pissing and shitting and spanking the Marseillaise, that's the French national anthem, and a transsexual in a nun's habit washing her genitals, auto-sodomizing with carrots and leeks, and giving, that means putting carrots and leeks up her bum, and giving one person a heart attack when revealing both breasts and a penis. Arrests did follow. So we can really see that that follows on from the work that some surrealists were doing with Georges Bataille's text, not least Solaranus. In Lebel's own words, I took consumer society and returned it like a bag with all its crap: nuclear technology, war, exploitation, misery, racism, pop fans, advertising, porno, cars, sports, the serious threat of a generalized nuclear conflict. It's a reaction against that. So let us just look at Allan Kaprow and Jean-Jacques Lebel and make a comparison between these American and European type happenings. We can see on screen that Kaprow's happenings were scored, therefore controlled to a degree, and Lebel's were unscored and more chaotic. Kaprow was influenced very much by John Cage and Jackson Pollock, whereas Lebel was more overtly influenced by Dada and Surrealism. Kaprow was apolitical, meaning not political, but he did aim to change attitudes towards life. Lebel was more overtly political, directly critiquing consumer society, but at the same time was very much about sex and drugs. The Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama was a manic presence in New York City during the 1960s. She produced numerous events called happenings where nude men and women, in the parlance of the tabloids press, cavorted their bodies, painted all over with polka dots by the artist. These events included at least one gay wedding, some 50, 60 years before it was legalized. Kusama cited her events in very public and provocative locations, like the Museum of Modern Art Sculpture Garden, or on Brooklyn Bridge, Wall Street, in front of the Stock Exchange. In the press, which she courted, Kusama was identified with free love and psychedelic hippie culture. She understood herself as the high priestess of polka dots in her own church of self-obliteration. Her work was at the forefront of the US sexual revolution and the emergence of gay identities. Let's look at a couple of images of hers. Here we've got a recreation of Alice in Wonderland with naked people and polka dots. Installation. And here is her more recently. Kusama engaged politics in the selection of her locations, or sites as she called them. But she was far from a feminist artist. In fact, she was absolutely mad. And in 1968, she returned to Japan, where she lives today, happily and productively in a mental hospital. Some of you might know Claus Oldenberg, perhaps associating him with pop art. His audacious, witty, and profound depictions of everyday objects have earned him a reputation of one of the most important artists of the 20th century. But what you might not know is he also made happenings. Oldenberg's happenings obviously owe a lot to Kaprow, but they also had their differences, as Hal Foster explains. Quote, while Kaprow may have been too indirect in his wish to underscore the hold of market forces on our lives, and our consumption of art in particular, Oldenberg addresses this issue head on. So what the art critic Hal Foster is saying is that Kaprow's reluctant to become political, but is hinting that things are about consumerism, and Claus Oldenberg is directly attacking consumerism. For Oldenberg, happenings became a kind of experimental theatre. The name he gave to his own productions was, after all, ray gun theatre. This formed a central strand to his work in the 1960s. Until now, our knowledge of his happenings has been limited really to photographs and some published accounts. A recent discovery shed some light on them though. A group of films documenting Oldenberg's happenings was restored, especially for an exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York in 2009. And this offered new insights into Oldenberg's happenings and his early career. Projected in loops around the walls of the gallery, each film, shot by a different filmmaker, reveals the structure and the form of Oldenberg's approach. 3 films, Photo Death, 1961, Injun, 1962, and Auto Bodies, 1965, had never been seen since they happened in the 1960s. Oldenberg created sets from everyday materials such as draped muslin, old furniture, mirrors and tables, and also incorporated costumes, large coloured sculptural forms and painted words, accompanied by vinyl records, drums, the radio, and other live noises. Oldenberg performed with artists and friends. The apparently chaotic quality of his happenings seemed to evoke the experience of modern urban life, which Oldenberg described as a clamour of weather, geography, home life, crime, products, food, traffic heroes, and entertainment, all vying for attention. Oldenberg constructed his first environment, the street, which became the dishevelled setting for his first happening, called Snapshot from the City. It consisted of a load of silhouettes made from torn out and torched rubbish collected in the streets. Lots of corrugated cardboard, burlap, old newspapers, and also more garbage spread on the floor. Foremost and recurrent among these silhouettes was that of a ray gun, a parody sci-fi toy somewhere between a hairdryer and a real gun. This was devised by Oldenberg as an emblem for all commodities. To enhance the market metaphor, Oldenberg offered the audience a snapshot from the city, large sums of money in quotations. These were ray gun currency money, bills ranging from 1,000 to 7,000 ray gun currency numbers. And you could use these to buy stuff from the street and the store. Stuff such as other junk that he and his fellow artist, Jim Dine, had been adding for this occasion. So let's look at the store. You can probably tell from these photographs that they are far too good quality to have been from the early 60s. So these must be reproductions or photographs from when they were restaged at the Whitney in 2009. Although a partial realization of the store took place in the group show called Environment, Situations and Spaces at Martha Jackson's gallery in '61, it was only in December of that year that Oldenberg opened the outlets of his ray gun manufacturing company at 107 East 2nd Street in an area of Manhattan that contains a lot of so-called dime stores selling cheap or second-hand goods. Oldenberg's shelves in these shops were filled with obvious replicas of perishable foodstuffs or tiny objects of mass consumption, often oversized, made of cloth soaked in plaster and clumsily painted in garish colours applied with broad brushstrokes in an overt parody of abstract expressionism, a parody of Jackson Pollock and his like. These baked potatoes, ice cream cones or blue shirts were never intended to pass for the real thing, and their price obviously indicated this. You would not buy a potato for between $25 to $800, but they were much cheaper at those prices than artworks. Their purpose was to demonstrate that since there was no fundamental difference between the rarefied commerce of art and the trade of a junk store, because both artworks and trinkets are nothing more than commodities. Therefore, one might as well skip the pretense altogether and treat artworks overtly as commodities. Oldenberg knew full well that his replicas would end up marketed as art and be given the special care that luxury goods enjoy. In his subsequent show, a solo exhibition at the Green Gallery in 1963, he presented for the first time his large-scale soft objects sprawled on the floor. And here we can see some of them, floor cone, floor burger, and floor cake. I have a video here about the store, but I'm not going to play it because we started a bit late and we're running out of time. If you wanted to Google it, you will be able to find that on, I think, the Whitney or the Met website. But now I want to move out of America and Europe to a different part of the world, to South America, where happenings also spread to. The arts in Brazil in the 1950s flourished, and Brazil established itself as an important centre for generating modernist ideas. There was a big art movement there called Neo-Concretism, which looked like it came out of movements like the style, which is, you will know it from Mondrian. Two artists, Lygia and Helio Oiticica, were among the primary leaders of this movement, and it took a step through environmental art towards installation. From 1964 to 1969, Oiticica made environmental participatory events, among them the Parangole, Tropicalia, and, my Brazilian Portuguese is getting tested here, Apocalyptopsis. They were either done in art centres or on the streets. A Guggenheim Fellowship took him in 1970 to New York, where he lived for the next 8 years until 1978. During that period, he prepared various multimedia projects in the form of texts, performances, films, and environments. Bolides are small three-dimensional pieces, often handmade painted boxes, that include brightly coloured pigments and other elemental materials. Parangoles were a kind of life art that came out of a time when Oiticica went to live with the inhabitants of the Mangueira favela. A favela is a word for a shanty town in Rio de Janeiro, where he created personalized visions of carnival dance rituals and costumes to go with them. Parangoles are brightly coloured fabric cloaks worn by the participants while moving or dancing to samba music. These deliberately cheap and ephemeral materials were designed by Oiticica as a way to inject colour into the surrounding environments and animate it through dancing. As Oiticica's nephew explained, quote, "When people perform parangoles, they are moving the colour," end quote. They are made from a mixture of materials, including polyvinyl acetate, emulsion, canvas, cord, nylon, mesh, cotton, other fabrics, newsprint, and burlap, randomly stitched together. So far away from the precision of his earlier works, yet maintaining the same delicate approach, Oiticica sought to emphasize the fluidity of life in opposition to fixing and systematizing the world. The word parangoles derives from the Rio de Janeiro slang term that refers to a range of events or states, including idleness, agitation, an unexpected situation, or even a dance party. Similarly, the objects themselves have an indeterminate status, only truly coming alive through the movement of people who actually wear them. And on the right of the screen, you can see there's a recreation of his event at the Tate Gallery in London in 2007. Both Bolides and Parangoles related to other artists' work at the time, but also retained a personal and very Brazilian flavour. The titles are particular. Bolide means fireball, while parangole is a hard to define word, as we have just seen, but comes from Rio slang, kind of associated with devious behaviour of kind of spivs called malandro figures, never do well men who live off women. In the 1960s, the psychedelic experience was widely understood as revolutionary, albeit centered on individual consciousness. Drugs which induced it and the culture that sprang from them became a worldwide cultural vogue. It made the Brazilian artist famous. His 1967 installation Tropicalia, a walk-in installation abstractly based on a Rio de Janeiro favela, shantytown, gave its name to a cultural movement, including musicians and filmmakers. In devising his participatory forms of art, Oiticica was strongly influenced by purist abstract art of the kind taught by European exiles who fled Nazi Europe to South America. Both Oiticica and Lygia Clark's work was made to be interactive. Oiticica began making complex manipulable boxes, which the viewer was invited to play with. And as we're going to see, Lygia Clark made masks, bodysuits, and so on, which were intended to be worn and stimulate a variety of sensuous experiences. Oiticica's parangoles prefigured that. For Clark, the people would become the work, while Oiticica was committed to exploring a collective state of invention in his work with the poorer residents of Brazil's shantytowns. This is Lygia Clark. She was also an art therapist. And along with Oiticica, she created participatory works that challenged not only long-standing artistic traditions and dogmas, but also the role of the art object itself, as well as the role of the artist, the spectator, and the art institution. The two artists worked together, and their most groundbreaking works required the viewer to be part of the artwork and thereby experience it as a sense. The cocoon from 1959 consisted of surfaces folded over to form a double plane with an interior space between them, and this was a key motif in Clark's work. For creatures, 1959 to 63, she made sculptures which consisted of cutouts of geometric forms like circles, squares, and triangles, made out of aluminium sheets, hinged together so that the viewer could move their parts, thereby altering the shapes. Both Oiticica and Clark's work was made to be interactive. Oiticica began making complex manipulable boxes which the viewer was invited to play with. Clark made masks and bodysuits which were intended to be worn. Grub resulted from Clark's abandonment of metal for more malleable materials. She cut a black rubber sheet into a spiral with two parts of the same format joined, which could be manipulated by the viewer or stand out as a sculpture. She showed the work in different ways using the support of a strategically placed tree trunk and as a sculpture placed on the floor as well, which she did in the Venice Biennale of '68. As you look at all of these works coming up now, think of what you're doing in frameworks, because these are all very achievable artworks made from cheap materials that are participatory, that engage publics. Her continuing fascination with the plane led her to invite viewers in Caminando, 1963, to use paper and scissors to form a Mobius strip and to continue cutting along its plane, explaining that the meaning of the exercise came from the physical act of doing it. What is a Mobius strip, I hear you ask? A Mobius strip, or a Mobius band, is a surface with only one side and only one boundary. the Mobius strip has the mathematical property of being unorientable. So a strip of paper that you put into a circle has two sides, doesn't it? But this one doesn't, because it's twisted. So you could actually go all the way around this band and back in on yourself. In Dialogues with Hands, 1966, Clarke's hand joined the hand of a participant to interplay with an elastic Mobius band. The interplay of hands formed what she called a sculpture. A man and a woman, blindfolded with hoods, explore the pouches and cavities in each other's clothes, experiencing tactile sensations which metaphorically evoke the genital organs. As Lygia Clarke says, the idea is discovering one's own sex in the other. I never experienced the series Clothing, Body and Clothing. I have no desire or curiosity to dress in them. I am only interested to know the experiences of the person who puts them on, she said. How easy would it be for you to create a suit that people could explore? Clarke's focus on viewer participation led to the creation of two series, Relational Objects from 1975 to 1984, which were objects of everyday materials manipulated by the artist through the participants' bodies, and Sensorial Objects, 1966 to 68, where individual acts of experimentation with the objects became the focus of the art. Some of Clarke's garments included bodysuits with pockets, as we've just seen, sometimes filled with objects designed to create emotions, or attached magnets that would either attract or repel a participating human. She summed up her position in the title, "The House is the Body," a body enveloping environment in which the participant experienced rebirth, which was also based on sensorial experiences of the body in its relationship with materials and objects. She later used her relational objects in her holistic therapy sessions, placing seashells, stones, plastic bags filled with air, different fabrics, other materials, and so on or around her participant's body in order to provoke an emotional response. Clarke's interest in researching human interplay and group dynamic processes also led her to design diverse objects that were applied as a means of discourse and communication. The eyeglasses here that you're looking at not only help sharpen vision, they produce a new way of seeing. With her low-tech equipment, Clarke can be placed in the company of virtual reality perception researchers. The difference being that, even for the viewers, she keeps a secure grip on the sensational experience. I'm going to read a quote now. For Lygia Clarke, the spectator's behaviour in relation to her objects was important. No work or proposition carried a single meaning. Usually, during the setting up of her installations, Clarke wrote phrases like, "please handle" or "touch." This wasn't a politically aggressive attitude towards museums, but a stance and a territorial demarcation of this propositional field that she offered to the spectator. In a conservative society that sticks to rigid rituals demarcating one's behaviour, Lygia Clarke was interested in exposing the spectator to the collective. He or she was expected to manipulate pieces, break with art object separateness, and to take in the reactions of other viewers or peers. The scenario was also part of her research. Clark's work dealt not only with poetic and cognitive issues of the individual, but also the collective. Thinking about frameworks again, just have a look at the kinds of materials used in this piece. Biological architecture. For structuring the self, Clark activated the body through the body rather than through language. With the help of her relational objects, a kind of archive of memories and affections that laid on the surface of the subject and were in a state of sleep. While holding a piece of oakum, Clark states, a patient brought this piece of oakum and placed it inside his bathing suit. He said it was used to cover his vagina. He was a man, but he experienced his vagina. His whole problem was in relation to his father. So in summary of Lygia Clark, Clark believed that art should be experienced not just with the eyes, but as a total bodily encounter. The body was central to Clark's practice, but instead of simply depicting corporeal experience, Clark invited the participant to feel it. Clark abandoned art to become an art therapist. However, recent accounts of her work have understood this not as a relinquishment of art in itself, but as a critique of art's institutional constraints and as an embrace of the potential value of art as a social practice. In other words, maybe she didn't give up being an artist to become an art therapist. Maybe being an art therapist was a form of being an artist. So we have 20 minutes left of the lecture, which I would normally give over for questions. We could do that, but I have got another part which I will just get through quite quickly, I think. Finishing off our South American adventure, not just Brazil, but we're going to move to Argentina. Right-wing dictatorships sprung up in Latin America, and artists were arrested or silenced. Some spoke out and criticised their government in subtle ways. In Argentina in '66, the year of a military coup, there was already an official declaration that this was the year of the avant-garde. Artists took full advantage of the ironic opportunity. A group called Arte de los Medios, Art of the Media, made an anti-happening, an event that never took place, that the media makes the event was their point. So they make it up and the media report on it. At an anti-biennial held in the city of Cordoba to contest the 1966 third Biennial Americana de Arte, sponsored by an American corporation, artists produced street interventions, ambient pieces, happenings, conceptual arts, and contemporary dance works. The most radical action was saved for the end. The audience gathered to see a new happening. There's room in the world for everyone. The door of the theatre was blocked up so that no one could enter or leave. After about an hour, the restless, angry audience was treated to the entrance of a large group of students who were on strike after one of their leaders had been killed. They burst into the place singing slogans and they delivered a fiery speech. This work demonstrates that for many Argentinian artists, there were already no more wars between art and politics. Similarly, Graciela Carnevale's action, which took place at the end of the cycle of experimental art in the city of Rosario in '68. Her work also involved locking viewers into a space, this time a gallery. She had covered the windows of the gallery with posters so that no one could see out. And then she locked it and walked off with the key. It was then a question of waiting to see what would happen. How would the viewers release themselves from this situation? Carnevale was producing a moment of incarceration which had no clear outcome. Eventually, it was somebody on the outside, not the inside, who broke the window and allowed people to escape. In a recent interview with historian and critic Fabian Cerejido, Carnevale explained that she had hoped to incite a form of exemplary violence among the participants, who would be forced to take action once they realised their plight by breaking through the gallery's glass front door. And that is obviously very evocative of futurists looking to provoke audiences to acts of violence. And you could say that it's emancipatory because people were there hopeless, but they realise that maybe they can help themselves, and maybe by breaking the law, maybe by smashing a window. This action would effectively empower the audience members, moving them from a state of passive acquiescence to conscious agency. If you want to know more about all of these, I'm taking my examples from Claire Bishop's book, Artificial Hells, which is a kind of history of participatory arts. And she explains, and you will remember this artwork from the interview between Bishop and Boris Groys that you read the other week, but she explains how participatory art spread around the world and how it was different under different governments. So we've looked at fascist dictatorships in South America and how artists reacted. But in Russia, it was different because they had a communist dictatorship. And the Moscow-based Collective Actions Group, who were active from about 1976 onwards, is a good example of this. Performances usually involved taking a group of spectator participants out of the big city, Moscow, on a train for a few hours to a remote countryside location, often to snowy fields, reminiscent perhaps of Malevich's White Square paintings. There, some of the participants would be subjected to an enigmatic experience that subsequently became a focus for discussion and analysis by the group. So we can think of the journey, the physical act of leaving the city, the different environments, going out to a big wide open space as being a sensorial or sensuous experience. But we can also think of it as a political experience, getting away from the gaze of the dictatorship. For appearances in '76, the participant spectators were asked to wait and watch for something to appear in a distant field. Monastirski then took a photograph of the spectators and later explained that they had all appeared to him. These kind of events created a space of critical distance which did not exist under the conditions of communism. You'll remember Boris Groys talks about this in Bring the Noise about futurism. Under communism, he points out, everyone was a participant, at least in theory. You're all participating in this great social experiment as equals. But that meant there was no outside space for spectatorship and critical analysis. How can that happen? You can't be the art critic observing something if you are also participating in it. In this sense, the practice of this group is opposite to Western participatory art, which is aiming to get people to participate. So briefly, in conclusion, happenings are where you make something happen. The elimination of the audience was a key philosophical, art theoretical component to this, as the thing that you make happen is the activation of the viewer. The viewer becomes an integral part of the artwork, not a passive component. Happenings were transatlantic. One could argue that in the US they were not overtly political, and in Europe they were more political. In South America they were even more political. Although the term happening might not be used, Neo-Concretism provides some evidence that happenings were global. But perhaps its Latin components were overlooked in English-speaking countries, and it's only now that we are beginning to look outside of the white Western context. Although these artists were actually white, Lygia Clark and Helio, Oiticica and Graciela Carnevale are all white and middle class, in fact, they nonetheless do come from a different cultural background, which perhaps was overlooked.